Senator Hanson. Dear Mr President, pursuant to Standing Order 75, I propose that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion. Due to excessive remuneration paid to the CEO and their directors, the need to remove and replace the Board of Australia Post. Is the proposal supported? The proposal is supported. I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific times to speakers in today's debate, and with the concurrence of the Senate, I shall ask the clerks to set the clock accordingly, and I call Senator Hanson.
Thank you, Mr President. In recent weeks, it has been brought to the attention of the Australian people what the CEO of Australia Post is being paid. It was a complete outrage. It was raised last year, but nothing much happened about it. Again, it was raised again this year. In 2009, the Board of Australia Post reported in the annual report the Managing Director and some key senior executives were all employed under ongoing employment contracts, which could be terminated with 60 to 90 days' notice. In the case of the Managing Director, he would be entitled, on termination of his contract, to 60 days' pay and 1.5 times his base salary. We can only guess what it is now. Apparently they are reluctant to put in full reports. You ask the question, why? Since then, the Board has progressively provided less and less remuneration information. 7 years ago, the Australian Post annual report named the highest paid individuals and reported their individual remuneration. In 2016, we know only that 20 people shared a pot of $18,702,653. I shall repeat that, $18,702,653. We had to rely on the media to find out the Managing Director was paid $5.6 million, of which he didn't need it because he gave over $2 million to charity. The payment of $5.6 million to the Managing Director of a government business enterprise is excessive. At some level, the Board must know the payments to senior staff reduced the dividend payable to government, which was just $20 million in the period 2015-2016. The Prime Minister's solution to this mess is novel. He suggests the Australia Post Managing Director give back any amount his conscience advises. The Board members of Australia Post are weak and lost. The Prime Minister's idea of voluntary return of salary already paid to the Managing Director of Australia Post and other key executives has little chance of success. It is self-evident to every Australian, except the Board members of Australia Post, that $5.6 million is excessive remuneration for the Managing Director of Australia Post. The Australia Post Board has proven itself incapable of bringing remuneration into line with community expectations. The Prime Minister's solution is unworkable. I have no choice but to try and fix the problem with a private member's bill, if I get the full support of my fellow senators, who must also be appalled with this disgusting remuneration package. The Board's failure to manage remuneration is just a symptom of a wider failure at Australia Post. The postal network is an essential service for the elderly, the homeless, or others without a fixed postal address, and people in rural and remote areas of Australia. Australia Post is required by law to provide a postal service even where it is unprofitable to do so. This is its community obligation. It is rural and remote post offices, often owned and managed by one person, which provide the essential postal service. Shockingly, these small businesses have found themselves bullied by Australia Post, locked into unfair financial agreements and unable to get paid for work done under contract. The Board of Australia Post have failed to implement the recommendations made by the 2014 Senate Committee on the Performance, Importance and Role of Australia Post in Australian Communities. There is no doubt the current Board of Australia Post needs to be replaced. I would expect the new Board members to implement the Senate recommendations. The current business model which operates at Australia Post needs to change. It is un-Australian to shift the responsibility for meeting non-profitable community obligations to franchisees in rural and remote Australia and then not pay them for all the work they do. It was never intended that the Board of Australia Post, with its overpaid managing director, would misuse the market power given to it by the Parliament. The unconscionable contracts with Australia Post franchisees must be changed so that it's not possible for someone to work for half an hour and get a payment of 34 cents. The government's usual response of writing to the board and calling the chairman to the Senate to answer questions is a demonstrated waste of time. The Labor Party attacked me for supporting some of the government's measures in the Omnibus Bill, saying it is hurting pensioners and the needy. Shutting down the Australian Post Board and the remuneration is actually clearly not hurting pensioners, so I expect their support. The Minister for Finance and the Minister for Communications are the two shareholder ministers in Australia Post. It is time for a please explain to Australia. Thank you.
This is not just another political speech. This is a direct political detonation inside Parliament over what many Australians are calling a completely broken system at Australia Post. Because what Pauline Hanson is exposing here is not just about salaries, it's about a deeper collapse in accountability at one of Australia's most essential public services. She walks into the Senate with a clear accusation that the Australia Post leadership is operating with excessive executive pay while hiding the real numbers from public scrutiny. And according to her, this isn't a one-time issue. It's been building for years, quietly ignored, and repeatedly raised without meaningful action. And this is where the situation starts escalating. Hanson points to what she describes as a disturbing pattern: declining transparency in annual reports, reduced disclosure of executive remuneration, and a system where the public is no longer fully aware of how taxpayer-linked institutions are paying their top leadership. Then comes the number that triggers the political shockwave: the alleged multi-million-dollar compensation package for the managing director. In her argument, this isn't just high pay, it's disconnected pay. A figure she claims stands in direct contrast to the financial return delivered back to government and ultimately to the public. But she doesn't stop at the CEO. She expands the issue into something much larger: a governance failure. A board she describes as incapable of aligning executive pay with public expectations, and a system that has drifted away from accountability mechanisms that once existed in earlier reports. And this is where the debate shifts from salary to structure, because now she is not just questioning individuals. She is questioning the entire operating model of Australia Post. She brings attention to rural and remote communities, franchise operators, and small post office owners who, according to her, are trapped in unfair agreements and underpaid for essential service work. This transforms the argument from corporate excess into public service breakdown. At this point, the speech becomes less about one institution and more about a national warning. A warning that essential services, especially those relied on by elderly Australians, rural communities, and vulnerable groups, are being impacted by what she frames as mismanagement at the top. Then comes the political pressure point. She directly challenges the government's response, dismissing it as ineffective, suggesting that asking for explanations and holding hearings has not produced real reform, only repetition of the same problems. And this is where the speech sharpens into its final message. Because now it is no longer just about Australia Post. It is about whether oversight mechanisms in Parliament are actually working at all. She calls for leadership change, board replacement, and structural reform, positioning the entire situation as something that can no longer be managed with small adjustments or voluntary actions. And the underlying message is clear: if this system cannot regulate itself, then political intervention is no longer optional. It is necessary.